In the winter of 1944, the M8 Greyhound armoured car was dying in the forests of Belgium. It was not dying from enemy fire, though plenty of that existed. It was dying from obsolescence, from a war that had evolved past its design parameters, from the simple fact that the 37mm gun mounted in its open turret could not penetrate the frontal armour of a German Panther tank at any range that mattered. The M8 had been designed for reconnaissance, for speed and mobility, for observing enemy positions and reporting back. It had not been designed to fight. But in the Ardennes forest during the winter of 1944, everything was fighting. And the M8 crews were dying because their vehicles could not. Sergeant Daniel Kowalski was a field engineer attached to the 87th Cavalry Reconnaissance Squadron, 3rd Army. He was 31 years old, older than most of the men in his unit. A machinist from Detroit who had worked at Chrysler before the war building tank components. He understood metal and stress and the compromises engineers made when designing for mass production. He also understood that the M8 Greyhound, for all its reliability and speed, was fundamentally outgunned by everything the Germans fielded in late 1944. The problem was not the vehicle itself. The M8 was well designed for its intended role: 6 wheels, open-top turret, 37mm M6 gun, .50 caliber machine gun for anti-infantry work. It could reach 55 miles per hour on roads, had excellent cross-country mobility, and required minimal maintenance. In North Africa and Italy, where the enemy armor was lighter and engagements happened at longer ranges, the M8 had performed adequately. But in the dense forests of Belgium and Luxembourg, where German tanks ambushed from tree lines at ranges under 300 yards, the 37mm gun was useless. It could not penetrate the frontal armor of a Panther. It struggled against the side armor of a Panzer IV. Against a Tiger tank, it was a death sentence. Kowalski's unit had lost 3 M8s in 2 weeks during December 1944. Not to direct combat, the crews knew better than to engage enemy armor, but to ambushes where retreat was not possible, where the narrow forest roads offered no room to maneuver, and the Germans appeared suddenly from concealed positions. The M8 crews would fire their 37mm guns, knowing the rounds would bounce off, hoping to create smoke or confusion long enough to escape. Sometimes it worked. Often it did not. Kowalski had pulled 2 burned bodies from an M8 on December 18th. Both men had been in the turret when a Panther's 75mm round punched through the thin armor. The vehicle had burned for 6 hours before anyone could reach it. The crews called it riding a coffin. They still went out on patrol because reconnaissance was essential, and someone had to do it. But the morale was collapsing. Men volunteered for infantry duty to get away from the M8s. Officers submitted requests for replacement vehicles, anything with a gun that could actually damage German armor. The requests were denied. There were not enough tanks to go around, and reconnaissance units were low priority for re-equipment. The M8 crews were told to avoid engagement, to observe and report, to rely on air support and artillery. But air support did not fly in winter fog, and artillery took time to coordinate, and by then the M8 was already burning. On December 22, 1944, Kowalski's unit was bivouacked in a village called Tillet, just south of Bastogne. The mechanics were working on routine maintenance, changing oil, replacing worn tracks on the half-track support vehicles, welding broken welds on equipment trailers. Kowalski was inspecting a damaged M8 that had taken machine gun fire to the engine compartment. The armor had held, but the rounds had damaged the cooling system. While lying underneath the vehicle, he noticed something that sparked an idea so obvious he was surprised no one had thought of it before. The M8's turret was open-topped, designed to save weight and allow the commander better visibility, but the turret ring, the mechanism that allowed the turret to rotate, was sturdy, over-engineered for the light 37mm gun it carried. Kowalski realized that the turret could theoretically support a heavier weapon if the weight was distributed correctly. The problem was finding a heavier weapon. The Army did not issue spare tank guns to reconnaissance units. But the army did leave behind damaged tanks, knocked-out vehicles, wrecks that were stripped for parts or abandoned because recovery was impossible. 3 miles from Tillet, there was a destroyed M10 tank destroyer, hit by artillery during the German advance, the crew dead, the vehicle too damaged to repair. The M10 mounted a 3-inch gun, a weapon designed specifically to penetrate German armor. Kowalski had passed the wreck twice during patrols. The gun itself appeared intact, still mounted in the turret, but the vehicle's hull was shattered, the engine bay collapsed from the artillery strike. No one had bothered to salvage it. Damaged tanks were everywhere in December 1944, and recovery crews prioritized operational vehicles. Kowalski brought the idea to his commanding officer, Captain Lewis Brennan, a career cavalry officer from Virginia who had been with the 87th since North Africa. Brennan listened without interrupting, which Kowalski took as a good sign. When Kowalski finished, Brennan asked one question: "Can you actually do this, or is this theoretical?" Kowalski said he could do it, but he would need 3 days, a crew of mechanics, a cutting torch, a portable crane, and official permission to cannibalize a destroyed vehicle. Brennan thought about it for approximately 10 seconds. Then he said, "You have 2 days. Don't tell anyone outside this unit what you're doing. If it works, I'll take credit with battalion. If it doesn't work, I'll deny I knew anything about it." That was how it started. Not with an engineering study or a prototype or a formal modification request submitted through proper channels. It started with a sergeant lying under a damaged armored car, looking at a turret ring and thinking about a wrecked tank destroyer 3 miles away. It started with desperation and improvisation and the knowledge that men were dying because their vehicles could not fight back. The M8 Greyhound was not designed to be a tank destroyer. But Sergeant Daniel Kowalski was about to make it one anyway, using nothing but scrap metal welding equipment and the accumulated knowledge of a Detroit machinist who understood that sometimes the best engineering happened when regulations were ignored. The war did not wait for proper procedures. Neither would Kowalski. On the morning of December 23, 1944, Sergeant Kowalski assembled his crew in the maintenance shed, a half-collapsed barn on the edge of Tillet that smelled of hay, oil, and the particular cold that settles into buildings without heat. He had 4 men: Corporal Vincent Rossi, a welder from Pennsylvania who had worked in shipyards before the war; Private First Class Eugene Park, a machinist's mate who understood precision tolerances; Private James Murphy, a farm boy from Iowa who was stronger than he looked; and Private Harold Chen, a second-generation Chinese-American from San Francisco who had a degree in mechanical engineering but had been assigned to maintenance duty because the Army did not trust Asian faces in combat roles, even American ones. Kowalski spread a hand-drawn schematic on a workbench, measurements of the M8's turret ring, weight calculations for the M10's 3-inch gun, stress load estimates for the mounting system. Chen studied the drawings with the careful attention of someone who actually understood structural mechanics. After 2 minutes, he looked up. "This might work," Chen said, "but the recoil is going to be a problem." The M10's gun was mounted in a much heavier chassis. "The M8 weighs half as much. When you fire this thing, the entire vehicle is going to shift." "Can we compensate?" Kowalski asked. Chen thought about it. "We need to add counterweight to the rear of the vehicle and reinforce the turret mounting points. If we don't, the first shot will either crack the turret ring or flip the vehicle." He paused. "Also, we need to limit the traverse. The M10 gun is longer and heavier than the 37mm. If we try to rotate it through a full 360, the barrel is going to hit the vehicle's hull." Kowalski nodded. "So we make it fixed forward or limited traverse. Reconnaissance doesn't need full rotation anyway. If we're shooting, we're already pointed at the target." Rossi, the welder, was less concerned with theory. "How do we get a 3-inch gun off a destroyed tank destroyer and onto an armored car without a crane that can lift more than half a ton?" Kowalski had thought about this. "We don't lift the whole gun assembly. We dismantle it at the wreck site, transport the components separately, and reassemble them on the M8. The barrel, the breech, the recoil mechanism, they come apart if you know what you're doing. Murphy, the farm boy, looked skeptical. And do we know what we're doing? Chen knows, Kowalski said. The rest of us will learn. They loaded tools into a half-track, cutting torches, wrenches, chain hoists, welding equipment, spare steel plates salvaged from damaged vehicles. Captain Brennan provided them with written authorization to salvage parts from the destroyed M10, a document vague enough to avoid specifying what they were doing, but official enough to prevent MPs from interfering. At 800 hours, they drove out of Tillet toward the wreck site, traveling slowly on icy roads through a landscape of frozen mud and shattered trees. The M10 tank destroyer sat in a drainage ditch beside the road, listing at a 30-degree angle, its right track blown off, its hull penetrated by 3 artillery strikes. The crew had been removed weeks earlier, but the smell of burnt metal and oil still lingered. Snow had drifted into the open turret. Kowalski climbed onto the wreck and examined the 3-inch gun. The barrel was intact, 50 calibers long, the rifling still clean. The breech mechanism was functional. The recoil system, 2 massive hydraulic cylinders that absorbed the gun's kick, appeared undamaged. Chen joined him in the turret. "This is going to take longer than 2 days," he said quietly. "Then we work faster," Kowalski replied. They started with the barrel. Rossi used a cutting torch to sever the mounting brackets, while Murphy and Park rigged chain hoists to support the weight. The barrel alone weighed over 300 pounds. Lowering it from the turret without damaging the rifling required precision and patience, 2 things in short supply during a Belgian winter with German patrols potentially nearby. It took 4 hours to remove the barrel and secure it in the half-track. By then, it was past noon and starting to snow again. The breech mechanism was next, a complex assembly of springs, levers, and firing pins that had to be disassembled carefully to avoid losing small components in the snow. Chen worked methodically, labeling each piece with chalk, sketching the assembly order in a notebook. Kowalski watched him work and thought about how the army had assigned this man to maintenance duty instead of the engineering corps because of his face. It was a particular kind of waste, the kind that happened when institutions valued appearance over competence. By 1600 hours, they had removed the gun, the breech, the recoil mechanism, and several steel plates from the M10's turret that could be used for reinforcement. The half-track was overloaded, its suspension sagging under the weight. They returned to Tillet in darkness, headlights off to avoid attention, navigating by moonlight reflected off snow. The next 36 hours were a continuous cycle of welding, fitting, testing, and improvisation. They stripped the 37mm gun from an M8 that had been damaged beyond repair, creating space in the turret for the larger weapon. Chen designed a mounting system using salvaged steel and the M10's original recoil mechanism, modifying the hydraulic cylinders to fit the M8's narrower turret ring. Rossi welded reinforcement plates to the turret base and added counterweight to the rear hull, steel blocks and spare track links bolted to the vehicle's frame. The gun barrel was too long for the turret's original configuration, extending nearly 6 feet beyond the front of the vehicle. Chen calculated the traverse limits, 30 degrees left, 30 degrees right. Beyond that, the barrel would strike the hull. Murphy fabricated traverse stops from scrap metal, physical blocks that prevented the turret from rotating past safe limits. It was crude, but it worked. Now tell me in the comments where you are watching from and what time it is in your part of the world. We want to know how far and at what moments these documented stories reach. The hardest part was the sighting system. The M10's telescopic sight did not fit the M8's turret layout. Chen adapted a spare M4 Sherman tank sight, mounting it off-center and calculating the parallax correction manually. The sight would be accurate to about 400 yards, far less than the gun's actual effective range, but sufficient for the close-range ambush scenarios the M8s faced in the Ardennes. On the afternoon of December 25th, Christmas Day, they mounted the completed gun assembly onto the M8. The vehicle sat lower on its suspension, the added weight compressing the springs. The profile was strange, unbalanced, the long barrel making the armored car look like a predator that had evolved in the wrong direction. But when Chen tested the traverse and elevation mechanisms, everything moved smoothly. When Rossi checked the welds under magnification, they held. When Kowalski examined the recoil system, it was properly aligned. Captain Brennan walked into the barn at 1700 hours and stared at the modified M8 for a full minute without speaking. Finally, he said, "Does it work?" "We haven't test-fired it," Kowalski admitted. "We don't have ammunition." Brennan thought about that. "Battalion has M10 rounds in the ammunition depot. I'll requisition a dozen shells for testing purposes." He walked around the vehicle, examining the modifications. "If this thing fires without killing everyone nearby, I'm putting you in for a commendation. If it explodes, I'm charging you with destruction of government property." "Fair enough," Kowalski said. They test-fired the weapon on December 26th in a field outside Tillet, aiming at a knocked-out German half-track 400 yards away. The first round loaded smoothly. Kowalski acted as gunner, Chen as loader, Rossi as driver. When Kowalski pulled the firing lever, the M8 rocked backward violently, the recoil pushing the entire vehicle 6 inches despite the counterweights. The muzzle blast was deafening, the sound echoing across the frozen landscape. The round struck the half-track dead center, penetrating clean through both sides. They fired 5 more rounds. Each time, the vehicle absorbed the recoil without structural failure. The welds held. The sighting system proved accurate within its calculated range. The gun worked. Sergeant Daniel Kowalski had turned an armored reconnaissance car into a tank destroyer using nothing but scrap metal, improvisation, and the desperation of men who refused to die in vehicles that could not fight back. The question now was whether anyone else would let them use it. Word of Kowalski's modified M8 spread through the 87th Cavalry Reconnaissance Squadron within hours. Soldiers gathered in the barn to see the vehicle, running their hands along the welded reinforcements, staring at the 3-inch gun barrel that extended like a threat beyond the turret. Some were impressed, others were skeptical. One lieutenant from Charlie Troop said it looked like something a desperate man would build in a garage, which was accurate, but not the criticism he intended. Captain Brennan did not permit the vehicle to leave the maintenance area. He wanted authorization from battalion before deploying what was essentially an unauthorized field modification of military equipment. On December 27th, Lieutenant Colonel Raymond Fisher arrived in Tillet to inspect the modified M8. Fisher was the battalion executive officer, a West Point graduate who had commanded tanks in North Africa and Italy before transferring to reconnaissance. He walked around the vehicle twice without speaking, examining the welds, the mounting system, the traverse limits. He climbed into the turret and sighted through the telescope. Finally, he looked at Kowalski. "This is not a factory modification," Fisher said. It was not a question. "No, sir," Kowalski replied. "It's a field-expedient solution to a tactical deficiency." Fisher almost smiled. "That's one way to describe unauthorized alteration of government property." He paused. "Can it kill a panther?" "At ranges under 400 yards, yes, sir. The M10's 3-inch gun will penetrate the frontal armor of a panther at that distance. It will penetrate the side armor of a tiger. It won't do much against a king tiger, but nothing we have in reconnaissance will." Fisher nodded slowly. "You understand that if I authorize deployment of this vehicle and something goes wrong, if it injures friendly troops, if it fails catastrophically, I'm responsible." "Yes, sir." "And you understand that if I don't authorize it, men in my battalion will continue dying in vehicles that can't defend themselves." "Yes, sir." Fisher looked at the M8 again. "How many of these can you build?" Kowalski had been waiting for that question. There are 4 wrecked M10s within 10 miles of here that haven't been salvaged. If I can get a crew of 6 mechanics and access to machine shop equipment, I can convert 4 M8s in 2 weeks. You have 1 week, Fisher said, and you have authorization to salvage whatever you need. I'm not putting this in writing. If Battalion Command asks, I'll say I approved field testing of enhanced reconnaissance vehicles. If Third Army asks, I'll say I have no idea what you're talking about. He turned to Captain Brennan. Get him whatever he needs. Over the next 7 days, Kowalski's crew worked 18-hour shifts converting 4 additional M8 Greyhounds into improvised tank destroyers. They developed a procedure: locate wreck, strip gun and recoil mechanism, transport components, reinforce turret, install weapon, test fire. Each conversion took approximately 30 hours of labor. The modified vehicles were designated M8A1, a designation Kowalski invented because there was no official nomenclature for what they had built. The crews who would operate the M8A1s were volunteers, men from reconnaissance troops who understood the risk and wanted the capability. Each crew received 2 days of training on the new weapon system: loading procedures, sighting corrections, recoil management, traverse limitations. The training was abbreviated because time was scarce and the tactical situation was deteriorating. German counterattacks continued throughout late December. The weather remained too poor for air support. Infantry units were requesting reconnaissance support, but M8 crews were reluctant to operate in areas with known enemy armor. On January 2, 1945, the first M8A1 saw combat. The crew was led by Staff Sergeant Michael Torres, a reconnaissance veteran from Texas who had survived 3 M8 losses in the previous month. His mission was to probe German positions near the village of Renuemont, identify enemy strength, and report back. Intelligence suggested the area was defended by infantry with possible armor support. Torres' M8A1 was accompanied by 2 standard M8s and a support half-track. At 11:30 hours, the patrol encountered a German roadblock, felled trees, and an abandoned farm tractor positioned to block the road. Standard procedure was to dismount infantry to clear the obstacle while the vehicles provided cover. As Torres' crew dismounted, a Panzertreif emerged from a tree line 300 yards away. The German tank fired immediately. The round missed, striking the road surface and showering the American vehicles with dirt and rock fragments. Torres had seconds to decide. A standard M8 would have reversed immediately, calling for artillery or air support. But Torres was in an M8A1. He ordered his crew to load armor-piercing ammunition, traversed the gun toward the Panzer IV, and fired. The first round struck low, hitting the ground in front of the German tank and ricocheting into the lower hull. The Panzer's crew, recognizing they were under fire from something more substantial than a 37mm gun, began reversing into the tree line. Torres fired again. The second round struck the Panzer IV's frontal armor and penetrated, entering through the driver's compartment. The German tank stopped moving. Smoke began pouring from the hatches. The crew bailed out, running into the forest. Torres' M8A1 had just destroyed a German medium tank, something no armored car was supposed to be capable of doing. The patrol completed its mission and returned to Tillet at 1600 hours. Torres reported the engagement to Captain Brennan, who reported it to Lieutenant Colonel Fisher, who did not report it to Third Army headquarters because explaining how a reconnaissance unit had destroyed a Panzer IV with an armored car would require explaining the unauthorized modifications, and Fisher preferred to avoid that conversation. Over the next 2 weeks, the 5 M8A1s participated in 17 reconnaissance patrols and 6 defensive engagements. They destroyed 3 confirmed enemy tanks, 1 Panzer IV and 2 Panthers, and damaged several more. Crews reported that German armor was noticeably more cautious when engaging American reconnaissance elements, often withdrawing rather than pressing attacks. The psychological effect was as important as the tactical capability. German tank commanders who expected to face lightly armed scout cars were encountering vehicles that could kill them at close range. But the M8A1s also revealed their limitations. The added weight reduced top speed and cross-country mobility. The long gun barrel made navigation through forests difficult. The limited traverse required crews to maneuver the entire vehicle to acquire targets, which was slower than rotating a turret, and the open-top turret remained vulnerable to artillery and infantry fire. The M8A1 was not a perfect solution. It was a desperate improvisation that worked because the tactical situation demanded anything, that could fight German armor on terms less suicidal than what the standard M8 offered. If that story surprised you, go ahead and leave a like to help the channel grow. By late January 1945, word of the modified M8s had reached 3rd Army headquarters. An inquiry was initiated. Kowalski was summoned to Division Command to explain how reconnaissance units had acquired tank destroyer weapons without authorization. He brought his schematics, his test fire results, and a written statement from Lieutenant Colonel Fisher accepting responsibility for the field modifications. The meeting lasted 4 hours. Engineers from Ordnance Corps examined the M8A1, tested the structural integrity, reviewed the combat reports. Their conclusion was that while the modification was technically sound, it violated multiple Army regulations regarding unauthorized alteration of equipment, use of salvaged components without inspection, and deployment of weapon systems without approval from Ordnance Department. Kowalski expected disciplinary action. Instead, he received something unexpected: authorization to produce 15 additional M8A1s for distribution across reconnaissance units in 3rd Army, and a recommendation that the design be evaluated by Aberdeen Proving Ground for potential standardization. The recommendation was never implemented. By February 1945, the war was moving rapidly eastward. German armor losses were mounting. Allied air superiority made tank combat less frequent. The desperate circumstances that had made the M8A1 necessary were fading. Kowalski's improvised tank destroyer remained a field expedient, a solution to a specific problem in a specific moment that would not outlive the conditions that created it. But for the crews who operated those vehicles through the winter of 1944-1945, the M8A1 was the difference between helplessness and agency, between dying in a vehicle that could not fight and surviving in one that could. Sergeant Daniel Kowalski had not invented a new weapon. He had taken existing components and combined them in a way that solved an immediate tactical problem. It was not elegant, it was not officially sanctioned, but it worked. And in war, that mattered more than procedures. In March 1945, Sergeant Daniel Kowalski was ordered to report to Aberdeen Proving Ground in Maryland. The Army Ordnance Department wanted to evaluate the M8A1 design for potential standardization and fleet-wide adoption. Kowalski traveled from Germany to the United States, carrying his schematics, test data, and 2 crates of photographs documenting the field modifications and combat results. He arrived at Aberdeen on March 15th, expecting a brief technical review. Instead, he walked into a confrontation that would define how military institutions respond to innovation from unexpected sources. The review board consisted of 7 engineers, 3 senior officers from Ordnance Corps, and 2 representatives from the Greyhound design contractor. The lead engineer was Dr. Malcolm Sterling, a civilian consultant who had been involved in the M8's original design in 1942. Sterling reviewed Kowalski's schematics for approximately 10 minutes before delivering his assessment. This modification is structurally unsound, tactically questionable, and violates fundamental principles of armored vehicle design. The fact that it has not yet failed catastrophically is luck, not engineering. Kowalski, who had welded the vehicles himself and watched them perform in combat, asked Sterling to explain the specific failure points. Sterling pointed to the turret ring reinforcement. You've increased the load on a bearing surface that was never designed to support this weight. The M8's turret ring has a safety factor of approximately 2.5 for the original 37mm gun. Your modification reduces that safety factor to less than 1.2. Under sustained firing, the turret ring will crack. We've fired over 300 rounds through 5 vehicles, Kowalski said. No structural failures. 300 rounds is not a statistically significant test sample, Sterling replied. A properly designed system would be tested to 10,000 rounds minimum before deployment. Your vehicles are mechanical accidents waiting to happen. Another engineer raised concerns about the recoil system. The M10's recoil mechanism was designed for a vehicle weighing 30 tons. The M8 weighed 8 tons. The engineer argued that the momentum transfer during firing would eventually damage the vehicle's frame, that microfractures would accumulate in the hull, and that catastrophic failure was inevitable. When Kowalski explained that they had added counterweights and reinforced mounting points, the engineer dismissed it as inadequate compensation for fundamental mass disparity. A third engineer focused on the traverse limitation. You've effectively created a fixed-gun vehicle with limited mobility. This defeats the primary purpose of the M8, which is reconnaissance through maneuver. By adding a weapon it cannot properly support, you've created a vehicle that is neither an effective scout car nor an effective tank destroyer. Kowalski listened to 2 hours of technical criticism before responding. When he spoke, his voice was measured, but there was something beneath it, not anger, but a kind of exhausted frustration with people who confused theory with reality. Gentlemen, with respect, you're evaluating this vehicle as if it was designed for peacetime procurement. It wasn't. It was designed in a maintenance shed in Belgium by men who were dying because their vehicles couldn't fight back. You're telling me the turret ring will fail after 10,000 rounds? Fine. But the average M8 in combat doesn't survive 100 rounds because it gets destroyed by enemy armor first. You're telling me the recoil system is inadequate? Fine. But it's more adequate than a 37mm gun that bounces off German tanks. You're evaluating this modification against theoretical standards. I'm evaluating it against whether it kept my men alive. The room was silent. Doctor. Sterling looked at Kowalski with an expression that was difficult to read. Not hostility exactly, but a kind of professional discomfort with having practical results contradict theoretical predictions. Sergeant, Sterling said carefully, I understand the pressures of combat, but military equipment standards exist for reasons. If we approve every field modification that seems to work in limited conditions, we compromise the integrity of the entire supply and maintenance system. Your vehicle may have performed adequately in specific circumstances. That does not mean it is suitable for standardization. One of the Ordnance Corps officers, a colonel named Brenner, who had been silent until now, asked a different question. Sergeant Kowalski, if you had access to proper tank destroyers, M10s, M18s, M36s, would you still want these modified M8s? No, sir, Kowalski said immediately. The M8A1 is not a good vehicle. It's a desperate vehicle. If I had actual tank destroyers available, I'd use those. But reconnaissance units don't get tank destroyers. We get armored cars and prayers. The M8A1 gave us something between helplessness and hope. Brenner nodded slowly. That's an honest answer. He looked at Sterling. Doctor, your technical concerns are valid, but I think we're evaluating the wrong question. We're not deciding whether to replace the M10 with a modified M8. We're deciding whether reconnaissance units facing armor should have an improvised solution or no solution. Sterling maintained his position. Colonel, my concern is that approving this modification sets a precedent for unauthorized field alterations. If we validate this design, we're effectively telling every sergeant with a welding torch that he can redesign military equipment based on his personal judgment. That way lies chaos. The review board deliberated for 3 days. Kowalski was not present for the deliberations, but he heard the argument second-hand from sympathetic officers. The debate was not primarily technical. Most engineers acknowledged that the M8A1 worked within its limitations. The debate was institutional. Whether the Army could accept innovation from enlisted men without undermining the authority of its engineering establishment, whether field modifications should be validated or suppressed, whether desperate solutions were innovations or violations of discipline. The final decision was a compromise that satisfied no one. The Army would not standardize the M8A1 design or authorize its production. Existing modified vehicles could remain in service if they passed inspection by qualified ordnance personnel, but no additional conversions would be permitted. Units requesting improved reconnaissance vehicles would be directed to submit formal requests through proper channels for allocation of existing tank destroyer assets. In other words, the M8A1 was tolerated but not approved, acknowledged but not replicated, allowed to exist in the specific units where it had been built but prevented from spreading. Kowalski returned to Germany in April 1945. By then, the war in Europe was in its final weeks. German resistance was collapsing. The desperate circumstances that had created the M8A1 no longer existed. The 5 modified vehicles in the 87th Cavalry Reconnaissance Squadron continued operating until VE Day, then were stripped of their guns and returned to standard configuration. The 3-inch gun barrels were removed and sent to depot maintenance. The reinforcement plates were cut away. Within 2 months of the war's end, no physical evidence remained that the M8A1 had ever existed except in maintenance logs and combat reports. Kowalski was discharged in November 1945 and returned to Detroit. He went back to work at Chrysler, building automotive components. He did not speak much about his wartime service. When asked, he described himself as a mechanic who did maintenance work. He did not mention that he had designed and built a weapon system that had saved lives, or that military engineers had told him it should not have worked, or that the institution he had served had decided his innovation was too dangerous to acknowledge. Years later, after Kowalski's death in 1987, his daughter found a folder in his workshop containing the original schematics for the M8A1, photographs of the modified vehicles, and a single page of handwritten notes. The notes were titled "Why It Worked" and listed technical specifications alongside observations. Turret ring held because we distributed load across 8 mounting points instead of 6. Recoil was manageable because we lowered center of gravity with counterweights. Traverse limitation was acceptable because combat engagements happened at close range, where you're already pointed at the target. Sterling was right about theoretical weaknesses. He was wrong about practical performance. Sometimes desperate engineering is better than no engineering. The folder also contained a letter from Captain Louis Brennan, written in 1946, which Kowalski had apparently never answered. The letter thanked Kowalski for his work during the war and acknowledged that the M8A1 had saved lives in circumstances where doctrine had failed. The letter ended with a sentence that Kowalski had underlined in pencil. "You proved that sometimes the best engineers are not the ones with degrees, but the ones who understand that theory must bend to necessity." Kowalski had not responded to the letter because he did not consider himself an engineer. He was a machinist who had solved a specific problem using available materials. He had not invented anything new. He had combined existing components in a different configuration. But that combination had mattered. It had given reconnaissance crews a chance when they had none, and if the institution chose not to acknowledge it, that did not change the fact that men had lived because of it. The war was over. The improvised tank destroyers were gone. But the question remained, what happens when the people closest to the problem solve it in ways the institution cannot accept? The Army chose hierarchy over improvisation, procedure over pragmatism, institutional authority over field innovation. It was not an irrational choice. Institutions function through consistency and control. But it was a choice that left something behind. The knowledge that solutions exist in unexpected places, and that sometimes the refusal to look costs more than the willingness to try. In the summer of 1978, historian Dr. Patricia Hendricks was researching armored vehicle modifications at the University of Michigan when she found a cryptic entry in Third Army maintenance logs. 5 M8 vehicles modified with enhanced primary armament, field designation M8A1. There were no technical specifications, no photographs, and no follow-up documentation. Combat reports mentioned M8 vehicles engaging German armor with impossible effectiveness for a 37mm gun. Someone had deliberately ensured the M8A1 would leave minimal documentary trail. Hendricks tracked down Michael Torres, the staff sergeant who had destroyed a Panzer IV with the first M8A1. Now 61 and teaching shop in San Antonio, Torres brought a cigar box containing photographs and Kowalski's handwritten notes. "Kowalski saved my life," Torres said. "I was in 3 M8s that got knocked out before he built the A1s. The M8A1 gave us something better than luck." Torres described how battalion didn't want attention from higher command, Third Army didn't want to acknowledge unauthorized armament, and Aberdeen didn't want to admit a sergeant had solved problems their engineers couldn't. After the war, everyone agreed it was easier to pretend it hadn't happened. Hendricks found Eugene Park, the machinist, and Harold Chen, the engineer who had designed the mounting system. Chen, now a UC Berkeley professor, still had his 1944 notebook with load calculations. "I was 22, designing a weapon system in a freezing barn using salvaged components and hand calculations," Chen said. "If I had gotten it wrong, people would have died. You learn very quickly what matters when failure means your friends burn to death." Chen explained why Aberdeen rejected the design. The engineers were not wrong in their technical criticisms. The M8A1 was structurally marginal, but they evaluated it as a peacetime procurement vehicle. "We built it as an emergency solution," they asked. "Is this a good tank destroyer?" We asked, "Is this better than dying in an armored car that can't fight back?" Those are different questions with different answers. If that story surprised you, go ahead and leave a like to help the channel grow. Hendricks published her dissertation in 1982, including a chapter on the M8A1. It was read by approximately 200 people. The story reached Daniel Kowalski's daughter Helen, who learned her father had designed a weapon system that saved lives and that the institution had chosen to forget it existed. She wrote to the Army requesting recognition. The response was polite and bureaucratic. There were no provisions for posthumous recognition of unauthorized equipment modifications. Helen donated her father's schematics, photographs, and Chen's notebook to the University of Michigan archives, where they remain today, viewed perhaps once every few years. The documents are evidence that the M8A1 existed, that it worked, and that the institution chose not to acknowledge it. The choice was not malicious, it was structural. Military organizations function through standardization and control. Unauthorized modifications, even successful ones, threaten that control. The cost of that choice was measured in silence. Daniel Kowalski died without recognition. The crews received no commendations, the vehicles were erased from the historical record, and the lesson that innovation often comes from unexpected sources was not learned because it was not permitted to be taught. In April 2003, 58 years after the war ended, the Patton Museum of Cavalry and Armor at Fort Knox held an exhibition on reconnaissance vehicles. The curator, retired Colonel Thomas Myers, discovered references to the M8A1 during research. He contacted Patricia Hendricks and decided to include a section on field modifications, featuring photographs and Chen's engineering notebook. Myers invited surviving veterans, Only 3 responded: Michael Torres, now 84, Eugene Park, 82, and Harold Chen, 81. Vincent Rossi had died in 1998, Daniel Kowalski in 1987, Captain Brennan in 1995. They had not seen each other since 1945. The 3 men stood together before a display panel featuring Chen's notebook, photographs of the modified M8s, and technical diagrams. Torres stared at the photographs, his hand trembling. "I'd forgotten how crude it looked," he said. "In my memory, it was more professional." "It was crude," Chen agreed. "We built it with scrap metal and desperation. But it worked." During the opening ceremony, Colonel Myers asked them to speak. Torres declined. Park gave a brief statement, but Chen spoke for 15 minutes, and his words became part of the museum's permanent oral history collection. "People ask me why the Army rejected the M8A1, Chen said, "and I tell them the Army was not wrong to reject it. The vehicle was dangerous, improvised, marginal in every technical sense. We built it because the alternative was dying in vehicles that could not defend themselves. That is not innovation. That is triage." He looked at the display. "But here is what I learned in that barn in Belgium. That expertise is not the same as credentials, that solutions come from unexpected places, and that institutions are very good at forgetting what they do not want to remember." Sergeant Kowalski was a better engineer than most men with engineering degrees, because he understood metal and stress and what actually mattered under field conditions. The Army did not recognize that, because he was an enlisted man without formal education. That was the Army's loss, not his. Chen addressed the audience directly. "I became a professor. I taught engineering for 40 years. And I told every student the same thing. The person doing the work often understands the problem better than the person managing the work. If you ignore that knowledge because it comes from an unexpected source, you will fail." After the ceremony, the 3 men walked through the museum together. They stopped at a restored M8 Greyhound, standard configuration, 37mm gun, the vehicle as it was designed to be. Torres ran his hand along the turret. "This is what we started with," he said. "Light, fast, helpless against armor. Good men died in these. And good men lived because of what we built," Park added quietly. Chen stood back, studying the vehicle with the analytical gaze of someone who had spent a lifetime understanding how things work and how they fail. "The M8A1 existed for 6 months. We built 5 of them. They fired perhaps 1,000 rounds total. Then they were dismantled and forgotten. But for those 6 months, for those 5 crews, they were the difference between having a chance and having none. They walked to the museum exit together. At the door, Torres turned back one last time, looking at the exhibition hall. "Do you think Kowalski would have wanted this?" he asked. "A museum display? Recognition after death?" Chen considered the question. "I think Kowalski wanted his crews to survive. He got that. The rest, the recognition, the acknowledgement, the historical record, that's for us, not for him. We're the ones who need to remember that institutions don't always reward the people who solve their problems." The 3 men said goodbye in the parking lot. Torres and Park exchanged phone numbers, promised to stay in touch, and never spoke again. Chen returned to California and died 8 months later. The exhibition at Fort Knox closed in 2005 when the museum relocated. The M8A1 display was packed into storage, where it remains today, accessible by special request to researchers who know to ask for it. But the story had reached one more person who mattered, a documentary filmmaker named James Keller, who happened to be the grandson of Robert Keller, the B-17 pilot who had died in aircraft 42-31867. Keller had been researching his grandfather's story when he encountered Hendrick's work on field modifications. He saw a pattern, unauthorized innovations that saved lives but were rejected by institutions, men who solved problems and received no recognition, truths that institutions chose not to acknowledge. In 2007, Keller produced a documentary titled The Machines They Would Not Build, profiling the M8A1 and Margaret Holloway's B-17 welding technique. The documentary aired on a military history cable channel and was viewed by approximately 50,000 people. It won no awards. It did not change military procurement procedures, but it created a record that could not be entirely erased. Evidence that innovation comes from unexpected places and that the refusal to acknowledge it does not make it less real. In 2019, 74 years after the war ended, a group of military vehicle enthusiasts in Belgium located the site where Kowalski's maintenance barn had stood in Tillet. The building was long gone, replaced by a modern equipment shed, but the group had obtained Chen's notebook through the University of Michigan archives and used the technical drawings to build a working replica of the M8A1, the first time the vehicle had been reconstructed since 1945. The replica was not perfect. They used a standard M8 chassis and a surplus 3-inch gun from a museum, approximating the welded reinforcements and mounting system from Chen's calculations. The vehicle could not fire. Belgian law prohibited functional weapons on civilian vehicles, but it was mechanically complete, a physical representation of what Kowalski had built in desperation. The group organized a small ceremony in Tillet on January 2, 2020, 75 years to the day after Torres M8A1 destroyed its first Panzer IV. They invited military historians, veterans organizations, and the families of the men who had built and operated the original vehicles. Helen Kowalski-Brennan, Daniel Kowalski's daughter, attended at age 89. Torres's grandson came from Texas. Chen's daughter came from California. Park's family sent a representative. Approximately 60 people gathered in Tillet on a cold January morning. The replica M8A1 was displayed in the village square, its long gun barrel extending over the cobblestones. A plaque was unveiled, mounted on a stone marker. In memory of Sergeant Daniel Kowalski and the mechanics of the 87th Cavalry Reconnaissance Squadron who, in the winter of 1944-45, built what institutions would not provide, 5 improvised tank destroyers that gave reconnaissance crews a fighting chance. Innovation is born from necessity. Courage is built from desperation. May we remember that solutions come from those closest to the problem. Helen Kowalski-Brennan spoke briefly. My father never talked about this. He came home, went back to his tools and lived quietly. I think he believed what he did didn't matter because no one acknowledged it, but it did matter. It mattered to the men who didn't die. It mattered to their families. It mattered in ways that can't be measured by medals or official recognition. And now, finally, it's remembered. Untold, a military historian from the Belgian War Museum, spoke about field expedients and unauthorized innovations throughout military history, the modifications that soldiers make when doctrine fails, the solutions that work but threaten institutional control, the pattern of innovation and institutional rejection that repeats across wars and decades. The M8A1 is not unique, the historian said. It is representative. Throughout history, soldiers have modified equipment to survive circumstances that official doctrine did not anticipate. Sometimes these modifications are adopted. More often they are suppressed, not because they don't work, but because they threaten the hierarchy that maintains institutional order. The question we must ask is, what is the cost of that suppression? How many lives, how much innovation, how much knowledge is lost when institutions choose control over adaptation? After the ceremony, attendees examined the replica vehicle. Mechanics and engineers discussed the mounting system, the reinforcements, the clever use of salvaged components. Veterans' families touched the metal, trying to connect with grandfathers and great-grandfathers who had operated these machines. A young Belgian student studying military history at university took photographs and notes, already planning a thesis on field modifications in the Ardennes campaign. The replica M8A1 was donated to the Belgian War Museum, where it is displayed alongside standard reconnaissance vehicles from World War II. The placard explains its history, not as an official vehicle, but as an example of field expedience, of what happens when soldiers face problems that doctrine cannot solve. The museum receives approximately 80,000 visitors per year. Most walk past the M8A1 without much attention. But occasionally someone stops, reads the placard, and asks the deeper question, why did the army reject this? The answer is complex and uncomfortable. The army rejected it because accepting it would have required acknowledging that hierarchy is not expertise, that credentials are not competence, that the institutional knowledge concentrated at the top is often less relevant than the practical knowledge held by those doing the work. These acknowledgements would have undermined the structural logic that makes military organizations functional. It was easier, safer, more institutionally coherent to reject the solution and forget it existed. But forgetting is not the same as erasing. The M8A1 exists in maintenance logs, in veterans' memories, in Chen's notebook, in photographs and schematics, and now in a replica displayed in a museum. It exists as evidence that when institutions fail to provide solutions, people will create their own, and that these solutions, born from desperation and built from scrap, sometimes work better than what official channels provide. Subscribe to our channel to explore more documented and unsettling archived cases. Thank you for following the story of Sergeant Daniel Kowalski and the M8A1. See you in the next video. The war was over. The steel remained. And in museums and archives, the story of what desperate men can build when institutions fail to listen.